Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for attending our first Equipped live event. So I think if you're watching this, you are probably familiar with the Equipped newsletter that we started a little over a year ago to let people know what's going on within the ESI client base. And the newsletter covers all range of topics, but we thought it might be valuable to dig a little deeper into some of them through a live event once a month for now. My name is Jackie Krafchek. I'm a corporate representative for Employment Services, and today we're going to be speaking with Greg Winter, and we're going to talk about the question or the topic of why are there so many different independent businesses instead of one great big business. So at the end of this, I'll give you a little more instruction as to looking forward to the next month and where you can watch this again. But we're going to dig right into that question. So let's get Greg on the screen.
Well, thank you, Jackie, and thanks for joining, everyone.
Hey, so Greg, I really just want to start with that question. So as simply as you can put it, why aren't all the businesses one business, and why are there so many different ones?
Well, largely because it's very difficult to grow large companies at the tip of peninsulas.
There you have it, folks. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you in a month. No, not really. So talk to us a little bit more about that, because you don't really see that happening with all the businesses in the peninsula. So talk to us a little bit more about that.
It depends on how you define large, but if you look at large companies as companies that employ hundreds or thousands of employees, those companies have followed a fairly normal pattern that's sort of like the human being aging. And so just like a person goes from being a child to an adolescent to an adult, and certain forces are at work, certain things change your ability to work, your ability to learn, your ability to do physical activities. That happens with corporations as well, and with organizations. And at the end of a peninsula, there are a number of forces that are at work that make it more and more difficult as you try to grow that company. So typically, what makes companies grow is when customers want more of their product. So one of the predictable things that happens is typically that company will strive to be more and more efficient. Meanwhile, competitors are now starting to offer maybe similar products because they're noticing the success as well. And there's price pressure now and competition for what they're offering. And so the focus really turns to efficiency. One of the ways to make that work is through further and further growth and larger scale. And so that's part of the normal aging process for large companies. By staying small, we don't have some of those forces working on us. And so, one of the big disadvantages is freight when you're at the end of a peninsula. Another one is typically just population. And so that affects the customers, it affects the workforce, et cetera. So by staying small, we end up not dealing with those same growth issues, but being much more agile and able to adapt to changing customer needs, et cetera.
So you mentioned the life cycle being much like that of a human from birth to death. Are you suggesting or implying that these companies have a death looming at some point?
Well, if we look at history, most companies do. There are very few companies that make it past 100 years. And those that do typically end up going through a fairly major restructuring and need to adapt, which is a painful process. So yeah, all of our companies are going through those aging processes on the positive side, when you're agile, when you've got a small company that's very agile and you can adapt to changing conditions in the market like are happening now. I mean, right now we've got a tremendous amount of supply chain issues and disruptions to the way that business gets done. COVID, of course, has disrupted a number of things, and small companies tend to be able to adapt to that much more readily than large companies that have kind of calcified and aged, and maybe they're not as nimble as they used to be.
Most of us aren't as nimble as we used to be. So
Exactly.
you did also mention one of the issues with the peninsula being the population and, especially from my perspective, the difficulty with workforce. So does that kind of lend itself to the reason why there are now multiple smaller businesses popping up around the state? Can you talk about that a little bit and how that fits into this multiple business picture?
Sure. Yeah, great question. Of course, Jackie, one of the real challenges that we've had is finding the competencies that we need. And that is a bit more of a challenge with a smaller organization, because with small organizations, people typically have a broader workload and they're not able to specialize quite as much as you can with larger, more efficient organizations. And so really, you need to have a broader range of skills. Those skills need to be in the business that we happen to be in, need to be craftsman level skills for the most part. And that's just very challenging to find. And of course, I'm just impressed with the people that we have and the way we've been able to bring new people in and bring them up to speed as well. And of course, ESI has facilitated a lot of that and done very well. But we have been growing at a pace that really we just can't find those folks in Northeast Michigan. And so we've been trying to find groups of folks with competencies in other areas. And the nice thing about that is we have been able to find some larger companies that have gone out of business, and we've been able to pick up some of the top talent from those teams to start other teams and other units in other cities.
Yeah, and I think that's working really well, and it makes a lot of sense. When we were first talking about this and kind of talking about this topic, you actually used an analogy or metaphor. I don't know which it would be, but you talked about two different animals, and you said an elephant and it was a jaguar or leopard. I don't remember, but could you talk about this in those terms? Because I think that really illustrates nicely what you're talking about.
Sure. Yeah, in that conversation, I was comparing a small startup or smaller companies that are very agile to cheetahs and the larger companies to elephants. And one of the reasons that really applies is the cheetahs in general can go from 0 to 60 miles an hour in 3 seconds. But they tend to weigh somewhere between 40, 50 pounds and 160 pounds. Elephants are able to go up to 25 miles an hour, but weigh 11,000 pounds. And so if you just kind of compare large companies to elephants, small companies to cheetahs, you can see why in changing times like we're experiencing now with not only a pandemic, but also wars taking place in the world, and now all the supply chain issues that are a consequence of that, you can see why cheetahs are much more likely to survive than elephants.
So I guess it wasn't a leopard or a jaguar, it was a cheetah. And now I sort of
Correct.
want Cheetos. when you and your siblings were first starting the company, and we will probably talk about that at some point during one of these Equipped Live, but did you foresee this sort of division of companies happening then, or what really drove you guys to go down that path of dividing into smaller companies?
Well, it depends on where we start, but if I talk about myself and how I got started, I really got started simply by reacting to what people were requesting of me. And so, I was fairly mechanically inclined, ended up getting a reputation for knowing how to make cars go fast. And so people brought their cars to me to fix and soup up. And I ended up buying and selling snowmobiles, motorcycles, cars that I bought in some state of disrepair and then fixed it up and sold it. And so, that's kind of where I got started. Then after graduating from high school, Ron, my brother, and my dad and another fellow by the name of Roger Cunningham had been in a business in Alpena that burned to the ground, and they were underinsured. They ended up parting ways. Ron ended up then joining me out on the farm where my dad had helped me convert a stable in one of the barns into a machine shop. And so in that, at that point in time, no, I didn't, I could barely spell business, but I knew I was just solving problems. But of course, when Ron joined me, now he had experience down in Southeast Michigan, and so he was able to bring industrial customers to us. But again, we were doing job shop fabricating, so we're listening to a customer's problem, we're solving that problem, and repeating that process. It's very, very difficult. You don't find many large companies that do job shop fabricating. They typically will start standardizing, much like Omni did with conveyor. The big difference with conveyor is that tends to, while there are a lot of modular components, there are also a lot of variables. So it tends to be pretty customized equipment. And so we ended up with the good, I guess it was our good fortune, but we ended up as a small job shop fabricator with the opportunity to build conveyor when a company called Standard Conveyor went on strike, and they were out of St. Paul, Minnesota. It turns out the customer, or our customer, was Besser Company. Besser had been buying from Standard. They approached us. Matter of fact, it was George Stevens, Gary Stevens' grandfather, that was head of purchasing at Besser. He had approached us and asked if we could build conveyor. And at the time, that was Omni Metalcraft. And of course, we were job shop fabricators. We could do that. George did explain that he understood that we probably wouldn't be competitive with our pricing, but he needed conveyor. So he had a supply chain issue, much like the supply chain issues that exist today. And so we started building the first few conveyors. We pretty quickly recognized that if we automated, we could be competitive in that business. And so at that point, we decided that we would hire Paul Diamond and Bill Kashner. And Paul focused on going out and finding all of Standard Conveyor's other customers. And Bill Kashner focused on developing the standard product line. And that's really how Omni got started. That was, once we went through that process, that was probably the time where I started dreaming pretty big about how we could keep adding companies.
Awesome. That takes us actually almost right to our time, but that's, I think, a really valuable explanation as to how they became multiple companies. And for anybody who's listening and who's wondering, so ESI and the recruiting side of it, it's approximately 60 plus or minus a few companies that we actually are staffing for right now. So that's kind of the number that we're looking at. That's a huge number. That's a lot of different people. So it's been very successful splitting off like that. So I just have one final question. Can you now spell business?
I think so, because if I try to type it, spell check will make it correct for me.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, we really are out of time now. We're going to keep these to 15 minutes. So, Greg, thank you so much for being willing to tell these stories that we're going to continue to tell. For everybody who's listening or watching this today, pay attention to Equipped, to your email. We're going to give you information on the topic of the next one, the date and time of the next one, as well as where you can watch a recording of these as well. So, Greg, any final words?
I'd just like to thank all the team members and everyone that has made this possible. We've been able to facilitate that, but could not have done it without all the hard work and dedication of many, many people. So thank you. And I'd like to thank everyone for attending.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Greg. And then we'll see all of you at the next one. Bye now.